The first cup shattered before anyone dared to breathe. Pale tea spread across the black marble of the council hall like diluted blood, creeping toward the hem of an old duke's robe, while the ministers remained seated with their hands folded and their faces arranged into obedience. Above, colourless morning light crossed the glass ceiling and left the gold pillars cold. Elias Vane stood 3 steps behind the prince's chair, a silver pen in his gloved hand, recording the silence as if silence were also an imperial decree. Prince Cailan did not look at the broken cup. He had set it down too hard, but his face showed no irritation. Only that remote stillness which made alphas twice his age lower their eyes. At 27, he already carried the Empire's military command like a blade resting flat against his palm. Nothing about him appeared hurried. Not the line of his shoulders beneath the dark formal coat. Not the fingers resting on the arm of his chair. Not the grey eyes that moved from minister to minister until each remembered fear. The proposal, Cailan said, requires every household in the eastern provinces to submit bloodline records dating back 3 generations. Does Lord Severin intend to explain how famine survivors are meant to preserve documents better than the ministry preserved grain? His voice was even, almost mild. That made it worse. An unreadable alpha left no direction for surrender. Elias kept writing. Though the scent of agitated alpha pheromones had begun to thicken around the council table like smoke beneath a closed door, Lord Severin smiled with a patience polished by decades of court survival. Your Highness misunderstands my concern. Bloodline confusion is not a private inconvenience. It is a danger to succession, military stability, and public order. Hidden classifications have caused scandals before. His gaze passed over the officials, then paused on Elias for a fraction too long. A single false registry can rot the foundation beneath an empire. Elias lowered his eyes at precisely the correct angle. Not too submissive, not too proud. A beta secretary had no reason to react to bloodline fraud, and therefore he did not react. Under his gloves, however, his fingertips had gone numb. 3 years of forged documents and scent-blocking tonics had brought him into the palace. 8 days under Prince Cailan's command had taught him that survival was not safety. Every polished surface reflected him too clearly. Every alpha noticed too much. Then repair the foundation where it is cracked. Cailan replied, Do not burn every house to prove you own the ashes. He rose before Severin could answer, ending the meeting with the quiet violence of rank. Chairs scraped back. Ministers bowed in staggered waves. Some too deeply, some not deeply enough. Elias closed the council ledger and stepped aside as the prince passed him. For one brief second, Cailan's shadow crossed over his hands, and Elias felt the absurd impulse to hide the gloves behind his back. As if fabric could confess, the council dispersed into corridors lined with white stone and narrow windows. Outside, rain pressed against the palace glass in soundless sheets, turning the gardens into blurred ink. Elias followed 2 paces behind Cailan, carrying the ledger against his chest. This was the proper distance for a private secretary, near enough to receive orders, far enough to remain furniture. The prince walked without turning. Yet his first words landed with unsettling accuracy. You stopped writing when Severin mentioned false registries. Elias's pulse struck once against his throat. The ink caught on the paper. Your Highness, it was a clean lie. Small enough to avoid ornament, he had learned that elaborate lies attracted claws. His father had taught him numbers, codes, and archival systems. His mother had taught him how to sit beside powerful men without letting terror change her breathing. Elias had built a life from remnants. He had even built a face. Cailan glanced back. The movement was slight, but it pinned Elias more effectively than a hand around the wrist. Does palace paper often frighten you? before Elias could answer. Young officers appeared at the corridor's far end, their uniforms damp. Alpha scent raw with rain and iron. One stared too openly. Betas did not draw scent interest. Not in theory. But theory had never endured a corridor full of alphas. Elias had taken suppressants at dawn. Still. Proximity pressed against his skin. Secretary vain. One officer said, affecting cheer that failed to hide provocation. You look unwell. The palace must be exhausting for someone transferred from civil archives. Elias prepared the correct answer. He never used it. Kalen stopped walking, and the corridor seemed to narrow around him. You have mistaken my secretary for someone available to entertain you, he said. Report to the Western Garrison before sunset. If your judgment improves in 6 months. Perhaps you may return to a corridor without embarrassing the uniform. The officer bowed until his wet hair fell over his eyes. They moved on. Elias should have felt relief. Instead, confusion opened inside him. Small and sharp. Protection was never neutral in the palace. It was currency. Chain. Signal. Trap. A prince did not defend a newly appointed beta secretary from a minor insult unless he wanted something, suspected something, or had chosen a battlefield Elias could not see. When they reached the prince's study, Kalen removed his gloves with economical calm and placed them beside a map of the northern border. You may breathe now, he said. Elias set the ledger on the desk. I was breathing. Your Highness. The answer came too quickly. He regretted it. But Kalen only studied him across the desk. The study was warmer than the corridor. Lit by a low fire and shaded lamps, shelves climbed to the ceiling, marked with dispatches, tax reports, intelligence files, and law. Elias's body wanted distance. His mind wanted keys. Were you, Kalen asked? It was impossible to tell whether he meant the corridor, the council, or something deeper. Elias chose silence. Kalen let it stand, then slid a sealed folder across the desk. The Eastern Registry proposal is not dead. Severin will bring it back with cleaner language. Review the old bloodline statutes before tomorrow morning. I want every contradiction, exception, and concealed loophole. His gaze settled briefly on Elias's gloves. You have an archivist's memory. The compliment had teeth. Elias accepted the folder with both hands. I will prepare the notes before dawn. He turned to leave. But Kalen's voice halted him again. Vain. Elias looked back. The prince stood by the fire, his profile divided by firelight. Do not use the tonic served to palace staff. The dosage changed last month. It causes tremors in people with low tolerance. A pause followed. Too precise to be accidental. You hold your pen too carefully after lunch. For a moment. Elias heard nothing but rain. His first instinct was denial. His second was escape. Neither was useful. Thank you for the warning. Your Highness, he said, and bowed deep enough to end the conversation. In the corridor outside, he walked until he reached an alcove behind a marble statue. Only there did he press gloved fingers against his mouth and exhale. Kalen had noticed the tremor. Not everything. Perhaps, but enough. Enough became everything in the palace. Elias spent the afternoon buried in the West Archive, where dust softened the air and old paper carried only rot, ink, and time. The archivists ignored him after seeing his seal. Betas were useful there, precise, unobtrusive, unlikely to be drawn into dynastic scandals. Elias moved among the shelves with a lamp in hand, copying clauses from bloodline law while his real search unfolded beneath the official one. Registry amendments, emergency classifications, purge warrants, family names erased from index cards but not from binding threads. He found his father in the third locked cabinet after sunset. Not the full file. The Empire was not so careless. Only a cross-reference slip tucked between two fiscal ledgers. Vane. Alder. Former Deputy Keeper of Genetic Archives. Investigation transferred to Crown Military Office by special seal. Elias stared at his father's name until the letters separated from meaning. His hand did not shake. Grief. When repeated enough times. Learned manners. A sound came from the end of the aisle. Elias slid the slip beneath the registry folder as Kalen stepped into lamplight. Without the council's black severity, the prince seemed more human in a way Elias distrusted. The archive chief said you had not requested dinner. Kalen looked from the open cabinet to Elias's face. Diligence is admirable. Starvation is inefficient. He placed a covered tray on the table as if it were procedure rather than concern. I did not realize Your Highness delivered meals personally. Elias heard the edge in his own voice and could not dull it. Kalen's expression did not change. But the room altered. Like air before lightning. I do not, he said. Usually, the single word should have meant nothing. Elias felt it anyway. An unwanted pressure beneath the ribs. In the palace, even bread could arrive with invisible terms. Kalen did not approach. He stood across the table, leaving the cabinet between them. And for that Elias was unwillingly grateful. You dislike owing people, the prince said. Elias closed the folder. Most debts are collected with interest. And most secrets, Kalen asked. The question slipped between them with surgical quiet. Elias looked up. He let his face become empty in the way that had once made interrogators bored. Secrets are usually collected with blood. Kalen held his gaze. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched until the archive lamps flickered. Somewhere beyond the high windows. Thunder rolled over the capital. Kalen lowered his eyes first. Not in surrender, but as if he had chosen not to press on a bruise he had already seen. Bring the legal review to my private office at first bell. He turned to leave, then paused by the aisle. The Western Archive door sticks in wet weather. Do not let it close behind you. The warning was practical, impersonal. And because of that, it unsettled Elias more than a direct question would have. Only after Kalen's footsteps disappeared did Elias pull the hidden slip free again. Beneath the registry folder, a second page had loosened under the heat of the lamp. His father's name appeared again. This time beside an order authorizing seizure of private bloodline materials from the Vane residence. Below the order was a royal military seal, dark red and unmistakable. Kalen's seal, or rather, the seal of the office Kalen now held. The lamp flame bent hard in a draught. Elias read the document once, twice, and felt the room recede from him, not in panic, but in the terrible clarity that arrived when hope corrected itself into evidence. The prince who had shielded him in the corridor, warned him about the tonic, and placed food within reach, had also inherited the authority that destroyed his family. Whether Kalen had known or not, no longer mattered enough. The palace had many ways to smile before it opened its hand. Elias folded the page along its old crease and placed it against his heart, where no one could see the wound forming. The first bell had not finished its cold ringing when Elias placed the legal review on Prince Kalen's desk. He had copied 32 contradictions, 7 emergency clauses, and 1 obsolete decree that could embarrass Lord Severin before the entire council. He had not copied the order bearing his father's name. That page lay hidden beneath the lining of his coat, warmed by his body like a second heartbeat. Across the desk, Kalen read the report without lifting his eyes. And Elias watched the hand that signed imperial commands move calmly over paper that might once have sealed his family's ruin. You found more than I expected, Kalen said. Dawn stained the study windows in grey. He had not slept either. Elias could tell from the roughness at the edge of his voice, from the untouched tea near his elbow. An ordinary secretary would have felt honored by such attention. Elias felt only the terror of standing close to a locked door while holding the wrong key. "Lord Severin will dislike this," he replied. "Lord Severin dislikes anything he cannot catalogue." Kalen turned one page, paused, and looked up. "Including you." There it was again. That quiet blade inside a neutral sentence. Elias held his posture. The room smelled faintly of cedar, rain, and restrained alpha presence. Disciplined enough to be polite. Powerful enough to remind the body of hierarchy. Suppressants dulled Elias' responses, but they could not erase instinct. He kept both gloved hands folded behind his back. "I am already catalogued. Your Highness, Civil Archives. Third rank administrative transfer. Beta classification verified." Verified by whom? Kalen asked. Elias did not answer quickly. He allowed the silence to become official rather than frightened. By the same system that verifies everyone, a corner of Kalen's mouth moved. Not quite amusement. That was not reassurance. He closed the report and set his palm on top of it. "From today onward, you will handle my confidential correspondence personally. No clerks. No copying room. No shared seals." Elias's heart tightened. More proximity meant more risk. More trust meant less room to disappear. "If your Highness doubts my registry, assigning me confidential documents would be unwise." The words came out softer than he intended. Kalen studied him, and Elias wondered if the prince heard what remained unsaid more clearly than speech itself. "I doubt everyone's registry," Kalen said. "Yours is merely more interesting." He slid a stack of sealed letters forward. "Begin with these. Burn the drafts after encryption. Do not accept tea from anyone outside this room." In the following days, Kalen's study became a second cage, warmer than the archive, better lit, and infinitely more dangerous. Elias decoded dispatches, drafted replies, and stood beside the prince during private strategy sessions where men twice his age trembled under polite questions. Kalen never touched him. He rarely even moved near him. Yet his attention followed Elias like a closed hand hovering just above the skin. The court noticed. By the fourth day, rumors had already begun to gather beneath painted ceilings and around flowered screens. Lord Severin arrived on the fifth afternoon with a smile and a document bound in blue silk. Rain had finally stopped, leaving the palace washed pale beneath an empty sky. The council chamber smelled of damp wool, polished wood, and restless ambition. "For the health of the empire," Severin said, placing the document before the ministers, "I propose a temporary internal audit of all palace staff assigned to sensitive posts. Nothing invasive. A simple pheromone verification performed by licensed physicians. Those with honest records should welcome the restoration of trust." Elias stood behind Kalen's chair and felt the world narrow. The silver pen between his fingers remained still. Pheromone verification was simple only for those who had nothing to hide. For him, it was a noose made of procedure. He forced himself to lower his gaze to the blank minutes page and write, "Temporary internal audit. Sensitive posts. Licensed physicians. Honest records." Each phrase wore respectable clothing over a knife. Kalen did not immediately respond. He let the ministers murmur themselves into confidence. Only when Severin's smile began to settle did he tap 2 fingers on the proposal. "Which physicians?" Severin inclined his head. "The Ministry of Lineage can provide a list." So the same ministry requesting expanded authority will also produce the evidence proving such authority necessary. Several ministers looked away. Severin's expression cooled by 1 precise degree. "Does your Highness object to transparency?" I object to bad procedure, pretending to be virtue. Kalen leaned back, unhurried. Submit the names of every physician, their family affiliations, prior audits, and payment history. I will also require a legal opinion on whether palace servants may be compelled without imperial signature. Until then, no verification begins. Elias kept writing. His pulse had become a sound behind his ears. A delay was not salvation. A delay was a cup of water given to a condemned man. Yet he would have fallen without it. That night, Elias went to the apothecary hidden behind the laundry court, where palace workers bought headache powders and illegal sleep drops from a retired military medic with cataracts in one eye. Registry trouble, she asked. Sorting bottles beneath a green lamp. Elias placed 3 silver coins on the counter. I need a masking compound strong enough to survive a surface-level pheromone test. The medic's hand stilled. You're asking for something that ruins organs. I am asking for something that works. She studied his gloves, his collar, the stillness he had spent years perfecting. For a beta, you ask dangerous questions. Elias added 2 more coins. The old woman did not take them. For an omega, it would be worse. The word did not rise above a whisper, but it struck like broken glass. Elias did not move. After a moment, the medic pushed a tiny vial across the counter. 1 drop only. 2. And you may not stand afterward. 3. And no prince in this palace can save you. Elias returned through the servants' passage with the vial sewn into his sleeve. He had nearly reached the eastern staircase when he saw Kalen waiting beneath an unlit arch. The prince wore no ceremonial coat, only a dark shirt and a plain military cloak, which somehow made him more dangerous. Elias stopped at once. Somewhere behind the walls, water moved through old pipes with a sound like breathing. You walk strangely when you are hiding something. Kalen said at last. I was sent to collect inventory notes. The lie was ready. But exhaustion had worn its edges thin. Kalen's eyes moved briefly to his sleeve. From the apothecary, the silence answered. Elias felt anger then. Clean and desperate. Does your highness have guards following every servant, only the ones Severin is watching? Kalen stepped aside from the arch, deliberately leaving a path open. Whatever you purchased, do not use it before showing it to a physician you trust. Elias almost laughed. Trust was an expensive medicine, and he had never been wealthy. Do you know a physician who does not report to a ministry? A noble house. Or you? He asked. Kalen's jaw tightened. It was the smallest crack. But Elias saw it. No. Then your advice is ornamental. He walked past before courage failed him. Kalen did not stop him. That restraint followed Elias back to his room and sat with him in the dark long after he unstitched the vial from his sleeve. It would have been easier if the prince had threatened him. Instead, Kalen kept leaving doors open. And open doors made flight feel like betrayal. The banquet came 2 evenings later, announced as a celebration for returning border officers, but understood by everyone as Severin's testing ground. The great hall glittered with chandeliers, crystal glasses, and wet jewels. Alphas filled the room in layers commanders, heirs, ministers, foreign envoys, their scents tangled beneath perfume and wine until Elias's suppressant began to fray. He stood behind Kalen's right shoulder, reading attendants' names from a gold-edged card, while every nerve in his body counted exits. Severin approached with 2 young nobles in pale uniforms. Your Highness, he said, bowing. Your secretary is more delicate than the archives suggested. Palace service must be demanding. One noble laughed softly. Another leaned a fraction closer to Elias, testing the air with the rudeness of men born above consequence. Elias did not flinch, but heat gathered under his collar. a warning bloom beneath the skin. Kalen set down his wine, untouched. "If you have time to evaluate my staff's complexion, Lord Severin, perhaps your ministry is overfunded." The nearby conversations quieted. Severin accepted the insult with admirable grace. "Concern is not evaluation. Then concern yourself elsewhere." Kalen's voice did not rise, but something in it emptied the space around them. The young nobles withdrew first. Severin held a moment longer, his eyes lingering on Elias with scholarly patience, before bowing again. Elias should have felt protected. Instead, the hall tilted. The chandeliers blurred into trembling stars. He had taken only half a drop of the masking compound before the banquet. Not enough to destroy him. Enough to make his veins feel lined with frost. Vain. Kalen's voice reached him through the roar of blood. Elias straightened by force. The southern envoy's letter. He said, "Because work was safer than weakness." Kalen did not ask for the letter. He took one step closer, still not touching, and his presence lowered over Elias like a wall against the room. "You are finished for the evening. I am on duty. You are finished," Kalen repeated, and removed his dark cloak in one smooth motion. He placed it over Elias's shoulders before Elias could retreat. The fabric was warm from the prince's body, carrying cedar, steel, and the severe restraint of an alpha who knew exactly what his scent could do and kept it leashed. Elias froze. Around them, eyes turned. A prince's cloak was not casual. It was favor, possession, warning, shelter. Kalen's hand withdrew at once. "The night air is cold," he said, as if that explained anything beneath 100 chandeliers. Then, quieter. Meant only for Elias. "Stop pretending you are made of stone." The sentence struck somewhere the masking compound had left undefended. Elias bowed because it was the only way to hide his face. "As your highness commands." He left the hall through the side passage, the cloak heavy around him and the world unsteady underfoot. Only when he reached the shadowed corridor did he grip the wall. The prince's scent should have frightened him. It did. It also steadied the tremor in his bones. And that was far more dangerous. In his room, Elias locked the door, stripped off the cloak with hands that would not obey, and opened his medicine case. The suppressant tablets inside had begun to crumble at the edges, their pale surfaces veined with amber discoloration. He knew what it meant before he tested them in water. Failed stabilizers. Accelerated cycle. His first heat, delayed for years by illegal dosage and discipline, was no longer a distant catastrophe. It was approaching with the quiet inevitability of dawn. Elias sat on the floor beside the bed. Kalen's cloak pooled beside him like a captured knight. Beneath the lining of his own coat, his father's document pressed against his ribs. In one room, he held proof that the prince's office had destroyed his family. In the other, he held the warmth of the same prince's protection. His body, treacherous and terrified, chose that moment to release the faintest trace of hidden sweetness into the locked air. Elias covered his mouth with both hands. But there was no covering what had already begun. By morning, Elias had packed everything he owned into one narrow leather case. It was not much. 2 shirts, 3 forged identification papers, a roll of silver coins sewn into black cloth, his father's seized order folded flat inside a book of tax regulations, and the gloves he had worn since he was 16. He left Kalen's cloak on the chair by the window, brushed clean, folded with almost cruel precision. Returning it would require entering the prince's study. Keeping it would require admitting that warmth could become evidence. Elias chose neither. He locked the door behind him before the first servant lamps were lit. The eastern servants' gate should have opened at 6th bell for bakery carts. Instead, iron chains crossed the inner bars, and 2 imperial guards stood beneath the arch with their hands on their sword hilts. Their uniforms were too formal for routine watch. Elias slowed before he came close enough for them to notice the tremor under his calm. Beyond the gate, the capital lay under a white winter mist. Roofs and streets blurred into freedom. He could smell wet stone, horse sweat, morning bread. Then an officer stepped into view and read from a waxed order sheet. By command of the Ministry of Lineage, all palace exits are restricted until completion of internal identity review. The words struck Elias with the dull inevitability of a door closing underwater. Around him, kitchen boys, laundresses, junior clerks, and messengers whispered in confusion. None of them understood why a simple audit required locked gates. Elias understood too well. Lord Severin had not found proof yet, but he had found the shape of absence. The palace was no longer a workplace. It had become a net. Elias turned away before anyone could remember seeing him. Each step back through the service corridor demanded more strength than the last. The failed suppressants had left his body restless and untrustworthy. His temperature rose and fell without rhythm. The scent-blocking patch beneath his collar burned against his skin. He needed a physician, a locked room, perhaps 3 days of isolation. What he had instead was a palace full of alphas and a prince who noticed silence as if it were written in ink. At the west stairwell, a hand caught his sleeve. Elias nearly struck before he recognized Mira, one of the junior record clerks. A beta girl with ink permanently smudged near her left thumb. She lowered her voice. They searched the dormitory hall before dawn. Lord Severin's men. They said it was for contraband tonics. Her eyes flickered over his face and away. Too kind to stare. If you have anything difficult, hide it somewhere no one would connect to you. Why warn me? Elias asked. Suspicion arrived before gratitude. An old reflex. Mira smiled faintly. Without offense. Because last week you corrected my petition without signing your name. My brother kept his post because of it. She released his sleeve. The palace is cruel enough. It doesn't need help from people like us. Then she was gone, swallowed by a turn of grey uniforms and carrying trays. Elias stood motionless for a moment, holding the small ache her words left behind. He hid the leather case behind a loose panel in the disused accounts room and kept only the forged papers against his chest. By 9th bell, he was seated in Kaelin's study, copying border dispatches with the steady hand of a man not planning disappearance. The prince entered late. Rain on his shoulders, though there had been no rain in the courtyard. He took in the desk. The fresh ink, the absence of the cloak, and Elias's face in one long glance. You went to the eastern gate. Elias did not look up. I went to confirm the exit restriction order. With a travel case, the pen halted. A single dark bead of ink swelled at its tip. Kaelin removed his wet gloves slowly. Each movement controlled. You are efficient. Vain. Not careless. If you intended to resign, you would have submitted papers first, unless you feared they would be rejected. Elias resumed writing. Your Highness overestimates my respect for procedure. I underestimate very little. Kaelin came no closer. But the room seemed to shrink anyway. Severin requested authority to search private rooms assigned to staff near military offices. I denied it. He will return with imperial language by dusk. Elias's throat tightened. Then approve it. Kaelin's eyes sharpened. Why? Because refusing will make him certain there is something to find. It was the correct strategic answer. It was also a plea disguised as calculation. Let him search. Let him find nothing. Let me be gone before he learns where to look. Kaelin remained silent long enough for the fire to crack softly in the grate. "And is there?" Elias looked up then. He had prepared for questions, but not for the fatigue in Caelan's face. The prince looked as though he had spent the night standing between doors. Unable to close any of them, that should not have mattered. "Everyone has something to hide in the palace," Elias said, "even your highness." For the first time, Caelan's expression changed without permission. It was brief, almost gone before it appeared. But Elias saw the wound behind the rank. Before Caelan could answer, an attendant announced Lord Severin. The minister entered with 2 physicians in white palace coats and a courtesy that smelled of iron filings beneath silk. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion. The internal review has already begun in the southern wing. I thought it proper to offer your office the dignity of voluntary compliance before lesser servants are troubled." Severin's gaze rested on Elias's gloved hands. A secretary entrusted with confidential correspondence should be the first to reassure the court. Caelan's face returned to stone. "No examination occurs in my office." Then in the medical chamber. No. The refusal was quiet enough to frighten even the physicians. Severin Seahill, almost sadly. "Your Highness places me in a difficult position. If you shield a servant from lawful verification, the court may misunderstand your motive." Elias could feel heat gathering beneath his skin. Not emotional now. Not entirely. His body answered pressure with a dangerous sweetness pressing against the edges of the blocking patch. "Leave," Caelan said. Severin bowed, but his eyes did not lower. "As your Highness commands, for now." At the doorway, he paused. "I would advise all palace staff to remain available. The Emperor dislikes evasions where bloodlines are concerned." The door closed. In the stillness, after, Elias realized he had crushed the paper beneath his hand. Caelan saw it too. He stepped toward the desk, stopped when Elias stiffened, and changed direction toward the window instead. That small adjustment hurt more than force would have. "You are ill," Caelan said. Elias folded the ruined page. "I am tired." "You are lying. That has never disturbed anyone here before." Caelan turned from the window, and the grey light cut his face into severity and something more difficult. "It disturbs me." The words were not soft. They were worse. They had weight. Elias stood too quickly. The room tilted, then steadied through will alone. "Your Highness has no reason to be disturbed by a clerk." "You are not a clerk." "Then what am I?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Between them, the fire sank low, its last red coals reflected in the polished desk. Caelan did not answer immediately. His silence held too many possibilities suspect. Liability. Secret. Trap. Elias hated that some unreasonable part of him waited for another word. Someone Severin once cornered. Caelan said at last, "That is enough." It was not enough. It was almost unbearable. Elias gathered the dispatches. "I should return to the archive." "No." Caelan crossed to the side table and took up a sealed black token. "You will come with me. Where, somewhere, the physicians cannot enter without my order." Elias should have refused. He intended to. Then footsteps sounded outside the hall, several men, moving with purpose. Caelan opened the inner passage behind the bookcase before the knock came. Now. Vine. They passed through a corridor Elias had not known existed. Narrow and unlit, except for strips of cloudy glass set high in the wall. The air smelled of old dust and winter leaves. Caelan walked ahead, but never too far, pausing at every turn, as if accounting for Elias's slower breathing without acknowledging it. Elias despised the care. He depended on it anyway. By the time they emerged through a bronze door, his shirt clung coldly to his back, and the world had become too bright. The locked garden lay at the heart of the old palace. surrounded by walls taller than watchtowers and hidden from every public balcony. Dead vines climbed carved stone. A frozen pond reflected the white sky. At the center stood a glass pavilion, with half its panels misted over from age. Elias recognized it from forbidden maps, the Queen Mother's garden. Sealed after the late Empress died. No servant cleaned it. No courtier entered it. The Empire preserved grief better than justice. Kalen shut the bronze door and pressed the black token into its lock. A low mechanism answered from within the walls. "No one comes in unless I open it," he said. Elias backed away from the pavilion steps. That sounds less like shelter than imprisonment. Kalen accepted the accusation without flinching. Both can look similar from inside a palace. Is that how you justify it? No. That is how I fear it. The honesty came so bare and unexpected that Elias lost his reply. For a while, only the wind moved. It passed through bare branches and made them tap against the glass like patient fingers. Elias stood with his arms folded. Though the posture could no longer hide the tremor moving through him, Kalen remained several paces away. Hands visible. His alpha presence carefully restrained. "Tell me what Severin is hunting," he said. Elias laughed once. Quietly, without humor. "You already know enough. I know your registry is false." The garden seemed to drop away beneath his feet. Kalen continued. Voice controlled. "I know you react to alpha pressure, despite beta documentation. I know your suppressants are not standard medicine. I do not know what you are afraid I will do with that knowledge." Elias stared at him. Something inside him, held tight for years, began to split along an old seam. What do alphas usually do when they find something rare? Kalen's jaw tensed. "I am not asking as an alpha. You cannot take that off like a cloak." The words sharpened as his control thinned. "You were born with the right to enter every room. Command every guard. Sign every warrant. People like me survive by becoming paperwork no one bothers to read. Do not stand there and tell me your blood has nothing to do with this." Kalen went still. Elias realized too late how much he had revealed. The heat under his skin surged, blurring the edges of the garden. He gripped the back of a stone bench. Breath shallow. Hatred and fear tangling with the faint cedar scent Kalen was holding back so carefully. "If I were an Omega," Elias said, each word stripped raw by exhaustion. "Would you report me?" Kalen looked at him for a long moment. The answer, when it came, was quiet and absolute. "No." "Why?" Elias demanded. Kalen's eyes moved beyond him, toward the sealed pavilion. Toward some memory the garden had kept colder than winter. Because some truths become crimes only when the powerful need cages. It was not an explanation. It was a wound speaking through discipline. Elias might have answered. He might have accused him again. Might have thrown his father's document at his feet. Instead, pain folded through his abdomen, sudden and deep enough to steal the air from his lungs. At the same moment, voices rose beyond the garden wall. Guards, searching. Severin's men had reached the old wing. Elias's scent-blocking patch failed with a soft chemical burn against his throat. A faint sweetness entered the winter air. Fragile and unmistakable. Kalen's head lifted sharply. Not with hunger, but with alarm so fierce it looked almost like anger. Elias stepped back. One hand clamped over his collar as if he could force the truth inside his body again. Kalen did not move toward him. That restraint became the only thing keeping Elias upright. Outside the wall, a guard called for the bronze gate to be checked. Inside, the locked garden filled slowly with the secret Elias had built his life to bury. He looked at Kalen through the pale, trembling air and saw the exact moment suspicion ended. Not because the prince had solved a puzzle, but because the person in front of him had become terribly, dangerously real. Open the gate. The command struck the bronze door from the other side. Muffled by stone, yet sharp enough to make Elias flinch. His hand stayed clamped over the ruined patch at his throat. But the sweetness escaping through his fingers had already entered the frozen air. It was faint, nothing like the perfumes noble Omegas wore at court. Yet no false registry could imitate it. A rare bloodline only needed to exist, and every alpha within reach would eventually turn. Kalen moved, not toward Elias, but toward the gate. The restraint was so deliberate, Elias understood it before anything else. The prince crossed the dead leaves and placed his palm against the inner seal. Outside, a guard repeated the order. Less certain this time. Kalen's voice answered with the coldness of winter iron. This garden remains under imperial military restriction. Whoever gave you authority to disturb it may present himself to me in chains. Silence followed. Beyond the wall, boots shifted over gravel. Someone muttered Lord Severin's name. Kalen's expression did not change, but the air around him altered. His alpha presence, disciplined into near invisibility, unfurled enough to fill the cracks between stones. It was not desire. It was warning. Cheddar. 2. Steel. Storm over high walls, dense enough to smother Elias's fragile trace. The garden became Kalen's territory without his taking a single step closer. Tell Lord Severin, Kalen said, that if he mistakes ministry curiosity for royal command again, I will have his men reassigned to border graves before sunset. The words were quiet. Their effect was immediate. Footsteps retreated in uneven rhythm, carrying fear with them. Elias remained beside the stone bench, body shaking with a humiliating mixture of relief and dread. Kalen had hidden his scent. But hiding was not forgiveness. The truth now stood between them, visible as breath in cold air. Kalen turned back only after the corridor beyond the gate fell silent. He kept 10 paces between them. The pavilion has an inner room. The door locks. There is water stored inside. Sit there until I can send for medicine. Elias laughed under his breath, though pain made the sound thin. Medicine, from whom? A physician who reports to your court, or one who reports to Severin more discreetly. His voice trembled on the minister's name, and anger rose to cover it. I know one person who owes me more than he owes the ministry. Kalen opened the pavilion door, then stepped away from the entrance. Elias did not move. The sweetness in the air had grown warmer, threading through the dead garden with shameful persistence. Do not arrange my survival as if I have already agreed to belong to you. At that, Kalen's hand stilled on the lock. For the first time that evening, anger crossed the prince's face openly. If belonging were what I wanted, vain. I would not be explaining doors to you. Elias looked away first. He hated himself for it. He hated the way his body believed the alpha before his mind permitted anything so reckless. Kalen's anger vanished back beneath discipline. Inside or outside. Choose. But choose before Severin remembers courage. Elias entered because collapsing in the garden would only make him easier to carry. The pavilion smelled of dust, dormant soil, and dry wood. Beyond the main glass room, a screen of pale silk divided a smaller chamber where the late empress had once rested. The cushions had been covered, the bronze basin empty, the painted ceiling dim beneath years of neglect. Kalen found a ceramic water jar sealed with wax and broke it open. He set a cup on the floor outside the silk screen, then withdrew. The distance undid Elias more effectively than touch could have. He lowered himself behind the screen, fingers clumsy on his collar, and tore away the failed patch. Heat moved under his skin in waves. Not desire exactly, but a biological command carrying terror inside it. He had spent years treating his body as a document to be edited, redacted, falsified. Now the ink bled through every page. He heard Kaylin outside, not pacing, not approaching, only breathing like someone holding a blade by its edge. "Do you have suppressants left?" Kaylin asked. Elias closed his eyes. Spoiled. Masking compound. Half a drop 2 nights ago. A pause. "You used contraband without knowing its stabilizer. I knew enough." "No," Kaylin said, and the single word carried more fear than reproach. "You knew desperation." Elias wanted to answer cruelly. Cruelty would restore balance. Instead, his hand knocked against the water cup, and porcelain scraped the floor. Kaylin did not enter. "Drink." Elias drank because thirst was one humiliation he could obey without surrendering. After a while, a folded handkerchief slid beneath the screen, damp and cool. "For your neck," Kaylin said. Elias stared at the white cloth as if it were a treaty written in a forgotten language. He picked it up only when his skin burned too fiercely to remain proud. The cloth smelled of plain water, not Kaylin, even now. The prince had thought to remove his own scent from it. Night settled slowly over the locked garden. Servants lit lamps in distant wings of the palace. Their glow trembled beyond the high walls. Inside the pavilion, Elias drifted in and out of fever while Kaylin's shadow remained beyond the screen. Twice, messengers came to the bronze gate. Each time Kaylin left Elias only long enough to issue orders through the sealed grille. One order sent the Western Patrol to investigate false smoke near the stables. Another demanded all ministry physicians report to the South Infirmary for inventory inspection. Elias understood more than he wanted to. Kaylin was not merely hiding him, he was reshaping the night around him. Every false command created a trace that could be followed back. "You should leave," Elias said sometime after midnight. Voice hoarse behind the screen. "If they find you here tomorrow, no excuse will hold." Kaylin's answer came after a long silence. "Then tomorrow will be unpleasant. I am not worth a political scandal. I did not ask for your appraisal." That should have angered Elias. Instead, it pulled a weak, unwilling breath from him that almost resembled laughter. The fever dulled his caution. Old questions rose where discipline had thinned. "Did your office sign the vain seizure order?" The silence outside changed. Elias pressed his forehead against his knees, waiting for denial. Calculation. Anything that would restore the enemy into a manageable shape. Kaylin did not ask how Elias knew. "The office did," he said. "I was 17 when the first orders were filed. My father still held the seal." "Convenient." "Yes." Kaylin accepted the accusation without defense. "It is always convenient for power to inherit innocence. When I took command, the vein file had already been restricted. I requested access last year. It was denied by imperial privilege." A faint sound followed. Perhaps the heel of Kaylin's hand pressing against the floor. "I should have broken the lock sooner." Outside, wind dragged dead branches over the glass roof. Elias remembered his father's hands, stained with archive ink. His mother burning letters in the kitchen stove while telling him not to cry because smoke remembered faces. Grief came strangely in fever, not as a storm, but as a room suddenly opened. "My parents died because people like you waited for permission," he said. It was unfair in the exact way pain often chose. Kaylin did not correct him. "Yes," he answered. The simple admission unsettled Elias more than denial. He turned onto his side, exhausted by heat, anger, and the intolerable decency of a man he had needed to hate. "Do not do that. Do what make it difficult." Kaylin did not pretend to misunderstand. "You would prefer me cruel. Cruelty is clearer." A long pause passed between them. Then Kaylin said, very quietly, "My mother used to say the same. The pavilion seemed to hold its breath. Elias opened his eyes. Beyond the silk screen, Kaelin's shadow sat unmoving, head slightly bowed. The late empress, he asked. Though everyone knew the official story, frailty, winter illness, mourning ceremonies thick with white flowers, Kaelin's voice remained level. But it had gone somewhere distant. She was born to a minor noble house with a bloodline the court considered useful. They called it honor. They called it compatibility. They called every cage a duty until she forgot there had been a door. He stopped there. It was enough. Elias did not say he was sorry. Apology would have been too small, and pity too intimate. He only lowered his forehead to the damp handkerchief and let silence answer. Outside the screen, Kaelin drew a slow breath. For the rest of the night, he said little. He passed water when Elias reached blindly. He warned before moving. He never crossed the silk boundary. When the heat surged and Elias's instincts panicked at the alpha so close. Kaelin withdrew to the pavilion threshold despite the winter cold. Near dawn, exhaustion finally overcame the fever's sharpest edge. Elias woke to diluted silver seeping through the glass roof. The air had cooled. His body no longer felt like a sentence being carried out, only like a battlefield after the soldiers had gone. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the water cup, the folded cloths, the silk screen, and beyond it, Kaelin seated with his back against a pillar just outside the chamber. The prince was awake, paler than before, shadows deep beneath his eyes. One hand rested loose on his knee. The other was wrapped in a strip torn from his own shirt. Blood dried dark through the cloth. Elias stared until understanding arrived slowly, and then all at once. Kaelin had bitten into his palm through the night. Not from injury, from restraint, from forcing instinct into pain rather than letting it reach across the screen. Elias should have felt triumph. Proof that even disciplined alphas suffered under their blood. Instead, something in him loosened with such quiet devastation that he could not breathe for several seconds. Kaelin noticed he was awake and shifted as if to stand, then stopped when Elias's shoulders tensed. Even now, even after everything, the worst has passed, Kaelin said. His voice was rough. A physician left medicine at the outer gate. I checked the seal myself. Elias looked at the bandaged hand. You are bleeding. Kaelin glanced down, as though the wound belonged to someone else. It is manageable. The answer was absurd. It was also entirely him. Elias wanted to ask why. Wanted to ask what he expected in return. Wanted to throw gratitude away before it grew roots. What came out instead was barely audible. You could have left. Kaelin met his eyes through the thin veil of mourning. No. No explanation followed. No claim. No promise. No demand. The word sat between them with the weight of a vow neither had agreed to name. Elias lowered his eyes first. Not in defeat, but because looking any longer would have required a courage he had spent his life using elsewhere. Outside the garden walls, the palace began to wake. The empire resumed its polished cruelty, unaware that in its sealed and neglected heart, something fragile had survived the night. In the southern infirmary, Lord Severin received a small glass vial wrapped in a physician's cloth. It had been found in a refuse tray near the staff quarters. Its inner rim stained with residue from an illegal masking compound. Severin held it up to the morning light and watched the amber trace cling to the glass. Not proof. The physician whispered. Severin smiled with weary tenderness, as if correcting a beloved student. No, he said, but it is a scent leading toward a door. Lord Severin placed the glass vial on the table as though it were a flower. Morning light entered the consultation chamber through a painted window, breaking blue and gold across the minister's hands. Every cabinet had been locked, every servant dismissed. every sound outside muffled by heavy doors. Severin had arranged privacy with the elegance of a man who knew fear worked best without witnesses. "You look better than expected," Severin said. "Illegal masking compounds are imprecise things." Elias looked at the vial, then at the minister's face. He felt no surprise. Surprise belonged to people who believed the night could end cleanly. "If Your Excellency has evidence of contraband use, report it through proper channels." His voice was steady enough for any court stenographer. Proper channels are beautiful in theory. In practice, they leak. Severin nudged the vial with one finger. This residue alone proves little. A servant might conceal illness, addiction, an unsuitable affair. Palace life breeds all kinds of small dishonesty. His gaze lifted. It held no triumph, which made it worse. But there was scent in the old garden last night. Not enough for a public charge. Enough for a man who has spent 40 years studying bloodlines. Elias let silence become armor. Inside it, his body remembered the silk screen, the cup of water, the torn cloth around Kalen's hand. Memory had become dangerous overnight, warmer than it had any right to be. "Then Your Excellency should continue studying," he said. "A garden full of dead flowers may confuse the senses." Severin's expression softened, almost like an exhausted teacher correcting a gifted student who had chosen the wrong answer. "Elias Vane," Severin said quietly. The name struck harder than any accusation. Not the palace registry, not the beta transfer record, but the name before falsification became a room he could live inside. Son of Alder Vane, deputy keeper of genetic archives. Your father concealed prohibited lineage materials during the Eastern Purge. Your mother died during transfer. You disappeared from the civil orphan rolls at 16. The dead leave paperwork. Children leave gaps. Elias did not move. "If you knew all this, why not arrest me?" Severin folded both hands over his cane. "Because arrest is crude. Because His Highness has already made that difficult. Because I am not interested in punishing you for being born inconvenient." "No," Elias said. "You are interested in owning the inconvenience." A flicker crossed Severin's eyes. Not anger, but recognition. "You mistake management for ownership. Rare omegas have destabilized succession disputes, military alliances, noble inheritance, even border treaties. The Empire is not kind, Mr. Vane, but neither is chaos. You believe secrecy is freedom because no one has yet shown you what happens when every faction learns your value at once." Severin sounded reasonable. He built a cage from facts and held the door open, as if inviting Elias indoors out of rain. "Here is my mercy." Severin continued. "You confess privately to false registry. The ministry places you under protected classification. Your family case is reviewed quietly, with certain records restored. Prince Kalen is absolved of intentional concealment. The court is told he was deceived by a talented subordinate." Elias looked at the vial. "And if I decline," Severin turned it gently in the light, "then His Highness will face charges for obstructing an imperial audit, misusing military authority, hiding an unregistered omega, and compromising palace security under influence." He looked toward the window, where colored light trembled across his face. "Do not romanticize sacrifice, child. Powerful men survive scandal by feeding someone weaker to it." Elias thought of Kalen at dawn, pale against the pavilion pillar, bleeding because he had chosen pain over instinct. The thought arrived like betrayal. "You assume I care what happens to Prince Kalen." Severin's smile grew sad in a way that almost achieved sincerity. "No, I assume he cares what happens to you. That is far more useful." When Elias left the chamber, the palace corridor seemed too wide. too bright, full of exits that did not open. He reached the administrative wing, where clerks bent over ledgers as if numbers could protect them from history. Mira looked up and went still. She did not ask. Instead, she slid a copied memorandum beneath a blank tax sheet when no one was watching. Elias took it with mechanical calm. In the shadow of an alcove, he read Kalen's name 3 times before meaning settled. Inquiry preparation. Unauthorized delay of ministry verification. Conflicting military orders issued during internal review. Sealed garden restriction invoked without prior imperial approval. The document did not accuse him yet. It circled him. Every line Severin needed was already there, waiting only for Elias to become the reason. By late afternoon, Kalen's study had become a room full of restrained weather. Maps lay unrolled across the desk. 3 sealed files sat open, their ribbons cut. Kalen stood at the window, bandaged hand hidden behind his back, while Elias placed correspondence in order and pretended not to see the inquiry summons beneath a military dispatch. Neither mentioned Severin. Neither mentioned the garden. Silence had returned, but it no longer fit them properly. "You were called to the medical wing," Kalen said at last. Elias arranged the letters by date. Many staff were. "Do not answer me like a notice board." Elias's hand paused over a wax seal. He almost smiled, which felt indecent under the circumstances. "Then do not question me like a magistrate." Kalen turned from the window. The fading light left his eyes darker than usual. "What did Severin offer you?" It was unbearable that he understood the shape of danger so quickly. "A future with fewer locked gardens," Elias said. Kalen crossed half the room before stopping himself. The halted movement said more than a rival would have. "Do not agree to anything without telling me. So your Highness can forbid it, so I can choose the battlefield before you walk into it alone." Elias looked at the bandage, poorly concealed beneath his cuff. "You keep speaking as if we are on the same side." Kalen's face changed by a fraction. "Are we not?" The correct answer should have been simple. No, they were prince and fugitive. Alpha and hidden Omega. Heir of an office that had signed his father's ruin, and son of a woman crushed by the same system. But memory, traitorous and precise, answered with a cup of water placed where he could reach it. Elias lowered his eyes. There are no sides in a cage, only bars at different distances. Kalen came no closer. "Then let me break them." The words were too quiet to be a declaration, too dangerous to be dismissed. Elias felt something in him recoil not from fear, but from longing. It would be so easy to believe power could become shelter because one powerful man had chosen not to hurt him. That was how cages learned to call themselves home. "You cannot break a cage while sitting on its throne," he said, and bowed before Kalen could answer. Kalen let him go. That was the worst part. No order stopped him. No hand reached out. The door closed softly behind Elias, and in the corridor he stood still until his breathing steadied. To be protected without being held was a kind of mercy he had not prepared to survive. It left him free to choose, and every available choice had teeth. By moonrise, Elias had returned to the disused accounts room. He retrieved his hidden case, removed the forged papers, and burned 2 of them in a copper basin. The third he altered carefully. Not escape documents now, but evidence. He copied fragments of confidential correspondence in his own hand, then changed dates, softened seals, removed enough context to imply manipulation without proving treason too neatly. A perfect crime would be suspicious. A desperate one would be believed. He wrote a resignation letter in the dry style of civil administration. "Due to personal misconduct and dereliction of professional ethics, I hereby withdraw from service attached to the Crown Military Office." The wording was clean, meaningless, Safe. At the bottom, where another man might have written apology. He left only his name. His hand trembled there, and one drop of ink blurred the final letter. Elias waited for it to dry until it looked less like ink than a bruise. The palace found the documents before dawn because Elias placed them where the palace was trained to look, beneath a loose drawer in his work table. Behind a panel, careless enough to seem hurried. He allowed 2 guards to seize him in the corridor outside the archive. He did not struggle. Struggling would make the story emotional. And emotion belonged to Omegas. Lovers. Traitors. A beater. Spy. Cornered by his own ambition. Should be pale but composed. Elias gave them exactly that. The inquiry convened before noon in the Hall of Civic Virtue. A name old enough to have lost its shame. Ministers sat in ascending rows beneath carved imperial beasts. Severin stood near the center with the calm sorrow of a man forced into unpleasant duty. Kalen entered last. Formal black coat fastened to the throat. His bandaged hand hidden beneath a glove. His gaze found Elias at once. For 1 second, all the noise in the hall disappeared. Elias Vane, registered beater, is accused of falsifying internal memoranda, unlawfully accessing confidential correspondence, and attempting to misdirect ministry review procedures. Severin announced. Preliminary evidence suggests Prince Kalen acted on compromised information provided by his secretary. We therefore recommend separating His Highness's judgment from the misconduct of a subordinate who abused proximity to power. There it was, the door Severin had built for Kalen. Polished and open. Elias kept his eyes forward. He had chosen this. Let the court despise him. Let Kalen step through. Let the prince keep his command. His throne. His chance to break laws from the only place where laws listened. Elias could survive hatred. He had been raised by absence. He knew how to live where warmth could not follow. Kalen did not move toward that door. Instead, he looked at the altered documents laid before the council, at the smudged resignation letter, at Elias's deliberately expressionless face. Understanding entered him slowly, then violently, though his body remained still. Elias saw it happen and wished, too late, that he had learned to forge his own trembling better. Kalen lifted his head toward the council. These charges are false. A murmur passed through the hall. Severin's brows drew together in perfect concern. Your Highness, loyalty does you credit, but the evidence was written to be found, Kalen said. His voice cut through the chamber without rising. By someone who knew this court would rather punish a secretary than question a minister. Elias gave the smallest shake of his head. Stop. Kalen saw it. He ignored it. The prince stepped down from his place before the imperial dais and stood beside Elias, not touching him, not shielding him with his body like property, but aligning himself where everyone could see the choice. Elias Vane handled confidential correspondence under my direct authority. Every document he accessed because I placed it in his hands. Every delay in the ministry audit was ordered by me. His gaze moved across the ministers until the room quieted into dread. If the court intends to name protection a crime, Kalen said, each word measured and irreversible. Then begin with the man who gave it. Elias could not breathe. Severin's face remained composed, yet something hardened beneath the skin. Around them, the empire leaned forward, hungry for scandal, confused by a prince refusing the sacrifice laid at his feet. Kalen did not look at Elias again. Perhaps he knew that if he did, Elias's control would finally break in front of everyone. Elias Vane was acting under my direct protection, Kalen said, and I will answer for it before the empire. The hall inhaled. Ministers who had fed on scandals all their lives hesitated before this one, because it did not behave like scandal. A prince had been offered innocence and refused it. A secretary had arranged his own condemnation and been disobeyed. Between them there was no confession, no touch. Yet the chamber understood that something more dangerous than treason had entered the proceedings. A choice had been made in public. Calen stood beside Elias with his hands folded behind his back, ignoring the fact that he had just burned his own defense. Elias kept his eyes on the polished floor. In its black reflection, they appeared almost equal. Two dark figures divided by a seam of light. Reality corrected the illusion. Calen was the Empire's alpha heir. Elias was a hidden Omega wearing a false registry like skin. Lord Severin recovered first. That was his talent. He could step through a collapsing room without dust on his sleeves. "Your Highness," he said, voice heavy with sorrow rather than victory. Protection is a noble word. It can also conceal breaches of imperial law. No one here doubts your honor. We question whether your compassion has been exploited by a subordinate whose identity and motives remain unclear. Then clarify them. Calen said, "Begin with the evidence." An aide brought forward the altered correspondence Elias had planted, the resignation letter, and the contraband vial sealed in glass. The items looked pitifully small beneath the carved ceiling. Elias had made the trap convincing enough for mediocre men. He had underestimated Calen's refusal to behave like one. Severin lifted the resignation letter. The accused admitted misconduct in writing. "No," Calen said. He wrote a resignation designed to imply guilt while avoiding every precise charge. A trained archivist does not accidentally choose language that cannot survive legal scrutiny. He pointed to the copied memoranda. "The dates conflict with my private seal rotation. This cipher pattern was discontinued 3 weeks earlier. If Elias Vane intended treason, he would have done it better." A ripple passed through the benches. Elias wanted to vanish beneath it. Calen's defense was too intimate because it was built on attention. He knew how Elias wrote, how he corrected reports, how he avoided careless errors. The court heard legal argument. Elias heard sleepless nights in the study. The scratch of a pen over paper. A cloak placed over his shoulders beneath chandeliers. His sacrifice returned to him stripped bare. Not noble, not clean, merely understood. Severin did not falter. "You speak from admiration. I speak from review." Calen's gloved hand rested on the evidence table. "Bring the original registry request filed by your ministry 6 days ago." Severin's eyes narrowed. "Irrelevant." "Then refuse publicly." The hall quieted. One of the imperial judges gestured for the clerk. The request was brought from a side desk, its ribbon still uncut. Calen broke the seal himself. Lord Severin requested temporary authority to test palace staff assigned to sensitive offices. The risk assessment cites 3 prior incidents of false beta registration. He turned a page. 2 are old inheritance disputes. The 3rd is the Vane case. Elias's breath stopped. Calen held the page where the front row could see the annotations. The Vane case was never a false beta registration. It was an archival seizure concerning prohibited Omega lineage records. Murmurs grew teeth. Elias felt every stare shift toward him. Though Calen had not yet said what he was, the surname alone had entered the hall like a ghost. Vane, purge file, Omega lineage. He wanted to speak, but survival pressed his tongue down. Severin stepped forward. Those records were restricted for public stability. The previous generation nearly tore succession apart with compatibility claims and illicit protection pacts. Your Highness knows this history. There was his real blade, not denial, but justification. Calen looked at him. I know the official history. I also know the dead rarely sign their own confessions. He gave a second file to the judge. Alder Vane's seizure order was filed after his detention. yet it bears a witness statement dated before his arrest. That witness died 2 months earlier. Severin's mouth tightened. The Empire was under strain. The Empire is always under strain when it wants blood quietly. Kaelin's voice remained controlled. But something beneath it had begun to show not rage, not entirely grief, but the accumulation of a son who had read between sealed lines for years. Rare Omegas were registered as strategic assets. Families who resisted became disorderly households. My mother's household was classified the same way before her marriage contract was renamed Imperial Honor. The Emperor, seated behind a screen of carved jade, moved for the first time. "Kaelin," he said. One word. A warning wrapped in blood. The hall bowed its head without being told. Kaelin lowered his eyes only enough to acknowledge rank. "Your Majesty, this inquiry concerns whether a subordinate deceived me. It cannot be answered while the court refuses to name what he was hiding from." Severin cut in. Sharper now. "Careful. Your Highness, you approach disclosure of protected classification before proper petition." Kaelin turned to him. Protected from whom? No one answered. The question exposed too much. Protected classification, monitored living quarters, reproductive contracts, restricted travel, physicians who reported cycles like tax revenue. Elias had grown up beneath that shadow. Hearing it named in the hall where law dressed itself as virtue made nausea rise behind his ribs. Kaelin continued, every word chosen with cruel precision. "Elias Vane is not my property. He is not evidence of my weakness. He is not a weapon used against me. Unless this court admits that the existence of an unowned Omega is considered an attack on imperial order." The hall was no longer murmuring. It was listening in fear. I protected a person from men who mistook governance for possession. Elias finally looked at him. Kaelin's profile was rigid, his wounded hand hidden, his voice steady enough to deceive strangers. But Elias had seen him beyond the silk screen at dawn. He knew what discipline cost when no one applauded it. Kaelin was not saving him flawlessly. He was damaging himself in public with the calm of a man who had calculated the loss and accepted it. "Your Highness," Elias said. His voice sounded too small for the hall, yet it carried because the chamber had gone still. Kaelin's eyes moved to him at once. Beneath hundreds of watching faces, they had their first wordless argument. Kaelin's gaze said wait. Elias's answered no. Protection without permission was still a locked room, even if the person outside bled for him. Elias stepped away from Kaelin's side. Several guards shifted. Severin watched with sudden, keen attention. Elias bowed first to the imperial screen, then to the council. His hands, gloved as always, were steady when he raised them. He removed the right glove. Finger by finger. The exposed skin looked ordinary in the white light. Pale from years hidden beneath fabric, somehow that ordinariness hurt most. "My registry is false," Elias said, "not because I sought proximity to power, not because I intended to deceive a prince into scandal. I falsified it because the legal existence assigned to me would have placed my body under state supervision before I was old enough to understand the words used to justify it." He removed the second glove. The last layer of scent-blocking cloth left his skin. "I am an Omega of the Vane line." Chaos cracked outward in controlled fractures. A minister cursed. Someone knocked over an inkstand. Judges began speaking over one another. Guards looked to Kaelin, then to the Emperor, uncertain which command mattered more. Severin closed his eyes for half a second, as if receiving confirmation of a theorem. Kaelin did not move. Elias was grateful. If Kaelin had reached for him, then the court would have named every word before it possession. My father did hide lineage materials. Elias continued before anyone could seize the narrative. They were not tools of rebellion. They were refusals. Names of Omegas who rejected contracts. Medical records showing coercive treatments. Petitions buried by officials who later signed seizure orders against the families who filed them. He faced Severin. You call that stability because the dead cannot argue with your definitions. Severin's expression grew grave. Young man. Pain makes poor law. So does fear of losing control. The answer left Elias before caution could soften it. For one instant, Severin's age showed not weakness, but the weight of a lifetime spent believing cruelty performed neatly became responsibility. I have watched noble houses threaten war over one unbonded Omega, he said. Control was not kindness, it was prevention. Prevention of whose suffering, Elias asked. Some in the hall looked down. Kaelin's voice entered then, quiet and severe. If the Empire can only survive by denying personhood to those it fears, then what survives is not the Empire we claim to serve. The Emperor's hand tightened around the jade armrest. Enough. The word dropped from behind the screen and silenced the hall. The Emperor rose. Courtiers lowered themselves immediately. Kaelin remained standing. Elias did too, though every survival instinct screamed. The Emperor descended 3 steps from the dais, his face finally visible. He looked at Elias not with disgust, not even anger, but appraisal. That was worse. You have made yourself a public matter. Elias bowed. I was made one before I was born. Your Majesty. A rustle of horror moved through the chamber. The Emperor studied his son next. And you have mistaken personal sentiment for imperial reform. Kaelin answered evenly. I have mistaken nothing. You protected an unregistered Omega, obstructed a ministry review, and introduced restricted accusations into open inquiry. I introduced evidence. You introduced disorder. Disorder. The Empire's favorite name for pain that refused to remain private. Elias understood suddenly why Kaelin's mother had died behind ceremonies, why his father's file had been sealed, why every cage had been built from dignified language. Disorder was what they called the moment a person moved differently than their assigned use. The Emperor lifted one hand, pending formal judgment. Prince Kaelan is relieved of active military command. His seals are to be surrendered by nightfall. The hall reacted despite itself. Kaelin's command was not decoration. It held border armies, internal security, half the Empire's nervous system. Removing it was both punishment and warning. Kaelin did not flinch. Only Elias saw the faint tightening near his mouth. As for Elias Vane, the Emperor continued, his classification will be examined under imperial custody. No ministry, noble house, or military office will claim authority over him until the throne determines proper disposition. Kaelin stepped forward at once. Guards reached for swords. Elias turned his head. Do not, he said quietly. Kaelin stopped as if the word had struck bone. Their eyes met across a distance crowded with law. Elias wanted to say many things, that he was not afraid. Though he was, none of it could be spoken there. So he gave Kaelin the only gift still available. He stood upright while the guards approached, refusing to let captivity look like collapse. When one guard reached for his arm, Kaelin's alpha presence surged for a fraction of a second, dark and lethal enough to drain color from nearby faces. Then it vanished. Elias understood. It was the same restraint as the silk screen, the same bleeding hand, the same refusal to turn protection into a claim. He let the guard place the formal custody band around his wrist. As Elias was led toward the side doors, he passed close enough to Kaelin to see the frayed edge of his glove where the bandage pressed beneath it. Neither spoke. Speech would have been taken and used. Instead, Caelan lowered his eyes for the briefest moment to Elias's bare hands. No longer gloved. No longer hidden. Elias curled his fingers once. Not in farewell. Not in surrender. A sign too small for law. Caelan saw it. The travel permit arrived before breakfast. It lay on the narrow table in Elias's custody room. Beneath the restored Vane family registry and a plain envelope, sealed with no royal crest. The guard who delivered it would not meet his eyes. Outside the barred window, the eastern sky was turning the color of old pearl, and the palace roofs looked softer than they had any right to look. Elias stood barefoot on the cold floor and stared at the permit for a long time. It bore no destination, no escort requirement, no return condition. Only his legal name, written cleanly, and a space left open for his own hand. Caelan had sent him freedom without appearing at the door. That was crueler than pleading would have been. Elias understood the shape of it at once. No pursuit, no command, no glorious rescue performed before witnesses who would turn tenderness into ownership. Caelan had given him exactly what he had always claimed to want. A way out, a name restored, a road that did not end at the prince's feet. He should have signed it immediately. Instead, he opened the registry. His father's name had been returned to its proper line, not as criminal, not as traitor, but as deputy keeper of genetic archives. His mother's classification no longer ended with transfer. Beside it, in a hand, Elias recognized from hundreds of corrected dispatches. A note cited missing evidence and unlawful seizure procedure. Caelan's handwriting had always been severe. But here the ink carried pressure, not rage. Restraint pressed into paper. Across the palace, Caelan surrendered his command, seals without ceremony. The generals expected anger. The ministers expected negotiation. He gave them neither. In the old military office, he placed each seal in its lacquered box and signed the transfer ledgers with his uninjured hand. His bandaged palm remained hidden in his sleeve. Only Mira, standing among junior clerks with a stack of copied archives against her chest, noticed the faint tremor when he wrote Elias's name in the evidence index. "You know they will use those copies against you," she said softly when no one else was near enough to hear. Caelan did not look up. "They already have." Mira hesitated. She was no revolutionary. Her brother needed his post. Her family needed grain stipends, and courage had never fed anyone reliably. Yet she placed another packet beside the seal boxes. The archive staff found duplicate petitions, Omega households from the western provinces. Some signed, some marked deceased before judgment. Her voice lowered. "People are choosing sides." "Your Highness." "No," Caelan said, closing the file. "They are choosing which truth will cost less to deny." By the third day, the empire had begun to fracture in the way old glass fractured first as hairline brightness. Then all at once, reformist officials leaked burial warrants from sealed cabinets. Ambitious nobles denounced the ministry not from conscience, but because Severin's fall would loosen properties under his influence. Border officers who had served under Caelan delayed compliance with the temporary command transfer. Physicians, frightened by exposure, testified under anonymity about forced suppressants and falsified classifications. Lord Severin did not collapse beneath accusation. He stood before the emergency council with his cane upright between both hands and allowed the documents to be read aloud. He denied only what could be disproved. Everything else he answered with history. "You speak of autonomy as if noble houses did not once wage private war over compatibility claims. You speak of freedom as if rare bloodlines were not bought, stolen, hidden, and weaponized long before the ministry regulated them. I did not invent hunger. I built walls around it." Some ministers nodded despite themselves. Elias, brought into the chamber under guard. listened from the side gallery, with his wrists unbound for the first time since the inquiry. Severin's argument was not evil in the simple way stories preferred. It was worse. It was coherent. It had saved certain people from certain forms of chaos by sacrificing others quietly enough that stability could keep its clean face. Kalen stood below the imperial dais, stripped of military insignia, yet somehow more difficult to look away from. A wall built through a person is not protection, he said. It is architecture that has learned to bleed. His father watched from the jade screen. Older than power had allowed him to appear before. And what do you offer in its place? The emperor asked. Sentiment, public unrest, noble retaliation dressed as reform. I offer law that does not begin by deciding some lives are materials. Kalen answered. Independent registry review. Abolition of protected classification. Medical confidentiality outside ministry control. Travel rights. Inheritance rights. Criminal penalties for coerced bonding contracts. If the throne cannot stand unless it owns bodies, then the throne deserves to stand alone. The hall recoiled from the last sentence. Elias did not. He had heard what the others missed, not ambition, but refusal. Kalen was not bargaining for a crown. He was setting down its old conditions and waiting to see whether anything human could remain. Judgment did not come quickly. Empires disliked speed when forced to admit shame. Elias was released from custody before the final charter vote. Not as apology, but as procedural correction. The phrase amused him so bitterly that he almost smiled when the official read it. His room in the north wing was unlocked. His travel permit remained valid. His family registry, restored and copied, lay wrapped in oilcloth beside a purse of funds whose source no one named. Kalen did not visit. For 7 days, Elias told himself that absence was respect. On the 8th, he hated him for it. On the 9th, he packed the same narrow leather case he had packed before the gates closed. This time no guard stopped him. The eastern servants' gate opened at 6th bell. Iron chains removed. Bakery carts rattling through mist. Elias stood beneath the arch with the unsigned permit in his hand and discovered that freedom, when it finally arrived, could feel less like a door opening than a room disappearing behind him. The road beyond the palace smelled of wet bread and horse steam. The capital was waking. Vendors shouted under striped awnings. Children ran between carts. No one looked at him and saw a rare omega. A forbidden registry. A scandal that had made ministers sweat beneath silk collars. For several breathless minutes. He was only a man with a case and a road. He walked until the palace bells faded. At the river bridge, he stopped. The water below carried scraps of morning light between dark stones. Elias took out the permit, dipped the pen he had stolen from his own custody room, and placed the nib above the signature line. His hand did not move. He thought of his father's restored name, his mother's corrected file, Mira's quiet courage, Severin's walls, Kalen's bleeding palm, a cloak beneath chandeliers, a silk screen left uncrossed. The problem was not that Kalen had become necessary. Elias could survive losing necessary things. He had done so all his life. The problem was that Kalen had given him the one proof Elias had never known how to ask for the right to leave without being punished for it. Elias folded the permit unsigned. When he returned to the palace, dawn had become full morning. No dramatic storm announced him. No court gathered to witness devotion. He entered through the same servant's gate, case in hand, bare fingers visible without gloves. A guard stared, then stepped aside. In the old world, that small movement would have been impossible. In the new one, still unfinished and fragile, it felt like the first line of a law no one had yet dared write. The Reform Council was assembled in the East Chamber. Kalen stood at the long table with ministers. Judges, physicians, and provincial representatives arranged like opposing weather systems around him. He looked thinner than before, face composed, eyes shadowed. When Elias entered, conversation faltered. Kalen turned, for one suspended moment. All the distance they had practiced fell away, and neither had any rank to hide behind. Elias walked to the empty place beside him and set the unsigned travel permit on the table. "I was told I could leave," he said. Kalen looked at the permit, then at him. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "You can." "I know." Elias rested his bare hand on the restored registry. "That is why I came back." No one in the room understood the confession. Kalen did. His expression did not break, but something in his eyes altered with such force Elias had to look away. After a moment, Kalen turned to the council. "Then we continue," he said, but his voice had changed. It carried less iron now, and more breath. The charter passed 9 days later by a margin too narrow for history books to call noble. Severin was removed from office. Not executed. Not made into a convenient monster. He spent his final hearing arguing that reform would invite bloodshed. Perhaps some of it would. Elias knew freedom did not cleanse human hunger. It merely stopped calling cages mercy. Severin bowed to the emperor, then to Kalen, and finally to Elias with a sadness that might have been real. "I hope," he said. "You survive what you have opened." Elias answered, "So do I." Kalen accepted succession only after the charter was signed. He did not take a consort announcement before the court. Elias did not kneel at his side in ceremonial white. Instead, the first public decree of the new reign appointed Elias Vane as Commissioner for Registry Autonomy, a position half the court considered outrageous and the other half feared would become popular. That suited Elias. He had not survived a false life to become decoration in a true one. Months later, the locked garden opened. Workers removed the bronze mechanism from the gate and carried dead vines away in bundles. Spring entered cautiously at first, as if mistrusting permission. New leaves appeared along the old walls. The pond thawed. The glass pavilion was cleaned but not remade. Kalen had ordered the cracked panels left where they were, repaired with clear seams that caught the light. Scars should not be polished into lies, he said when Elias asked. On the first warm morning, Elias sat beneath the pavilion with a book open on his knee and read none of it. Kalen stood near the pond, speaking with a gardener about drainage, as if ruling an empire had finally taught him the importance of mud. No guards waited outside the gate. No silk screen divided the inner room. The air smelled of damp earth, young leaves, and the faint cedar trace Elias no longer feared. When the gardener left, Kalen came to stand beside the bench. He did not sit until Elias shifted the book, making space. Old habits still lived between them, but they no longer ruled uncontested. For a while they watched light move across the pond. Then Kalen asked, "Do you regret staying?" Elias turned one page. The wind lifted the corner and set it down again. He could have answered plainly. They had earned plainness, perhaps, but love had grown between them in restraint, in silence, in doors left open. Some truths still felt safer when given room to breathe. The air is better here than it used to be. Elias said. Kalen looked at him. And because no council watched, because no law waited to distort the gesture, he allowed himself the smallest smile. Elias kept his eyes on the unread page, but his bare hand rested between them on the bench, unhidden. After a moment, Kalen placed his hand beside it, close enough for warmth, not enough to claim. The garden gates remained open. Neither of them looked back to check.